Okay, the Mongols are approaching. Let's gather information on them. Okay, the Mongols are closer now. Let's conduct diplomacy with them and see what they want and see if we can negotiate something with them. The Mongols are even closer. Okay, we'll build up our defenses so we can protect ourselves. And then the Mongols invade. Now, every single country that adopted that course of action was destroyed. But that's also a course of action that today in the 21st century, most of us would see as being very, very logical, very sensible. But they all got destroyed. The cultures and the countries and regions that survived best were those who submitted really, really early. So, for example, the Kingdom of Silesia submitted long before the Mongols were within several hundred miles of their borders. They submitted really early, and the Mongols appreciated that and gave them preferential treatment.
Yes, welcome back to the second episode on the Mongol conquest of the Near East with Professor Nicholas Morton, a historian from Nottingham Trent University and author of the amazing and amazingly readable book, The Mongol Storm, Breaking Empires in the Medieval Near East. Welcome back, Professor Nick. I'm sorry.
Thank you. It's great to be back on the show.
You very kindly told me I can call you Nick, just so our listeners are not like, why is he so rude all of a sudden? Actually, we ended our last episode with a breathtaking hook, the arrival of the Mongol conquerors to this frenetic, fractured and complicated region filled with Christians and Muslims, regional powers of all kinds, such as the Crusader State, the Byzantium, the Seljuk Turks that were just subjugated at the end of the last episode over there in Anatolia, and then the Ayyubid Empire down in Egypt. But before we discuss what transpires next, I wanted to devote some time to war and military matters just for a second, because for much of the Mongol invasions, it seems like they're playing this game on God mode or something, you know, like they have a cheat code that is simply not accessible to their opponents, no matter what civilization they might be coming from, be it medieval China or medieval Hungary. The Mongols just bulldoze everything in front of them. And even if they get defeated, like you mentioned in the first episode, they immediately come back to crush you. Now, reading your book, it becomes clear that a lot of that comes down to one elementary civilizational aspect that we already addressed when talking about the Crusades. And that's the fact that there's a huge difference between medieval armies of an agricultural society, such as those of, I don't know, France or Egypt or China, and those of a nomad society, like the Mongols were. And that aspect is usually favoring the latter, isn't it?
Yeah, so if you were to ask people who they think were the most effective warriors in the medieval period, you'd probably get answers like Knights Templar.
Yeah, because they just look cool and they're covered in this armor, you know, and we've seen them in movies and they look like some sort of a mechanical, unbeatable warrior figure.
And they are very effective. You might also say the Bahri and Mamluks from the Mamluk Empire in Egypt. These are all very effective warriors. It would actually be quite rare for someone to pick a Central Asian steppe-mounted archer, but they are the most effective, without doubt. They're born and raised to ride and shoot and hunt. They can source their own weapons and their own arrows from either their animals or from the natural environment around them. They can cross rivers. Their wagon cities basically mean they have no logistics. They bring their food with them. They're incredibly hardy. If they're victorious in battle, they can fan out and cover enormous distances, raiding and attacking. And if they're defeated, well, they're all mounted. They can get out of the way. And in battle, because they're all expert shots, they can pour a barrage of arrows down on the slow-moving infantry forces of much of, I don't know, China or Western Europe or the Muslim world, and these slow-moving forces can't catch them. So it's very, very hard to defeat Central Asian steppe archers. And this is why, only a couple of centuries before the Mongols themselves, the Middle East had been conquered by another Central Asian power, the Seljuk Sultanate, very similar to the Mongols in many respects. And before that, you can identify all sorts of other steppe powers, whether that's the Avars or the Pechenegs or the Huns or others who have invaded agricultural societies around their margins. So, yeah, steppe archers are incredibly powerful and effective in battle, and they continue to dominate armies and the effectiveness of armies until the advent of advanced gunpowder weapons in, say, the 17th, 18th century, that sort of thing. So they dominate history for thousands of years. But Genghis Khan manages to create a war machine that's even more effective than that basic template. And he's got a number of military virtues. One of those virtues is the willingness to learn. So the Mongols realize early on that they're not actually that effective in siege warfare. So when they invade northern China, they go to great lengths to acquire as many siege engineers as possible who can manufacture massive siege crossbows or catapults for them. The Mongols also acquired gunpowder technology, and it's at this point in history that gunpowder technology spreads out from China to reach various places across Eurasia. So they're willing to learn, and they're also interested in mixing their forces with other forces. So the Mongols have a great liking for Georgian heavy cavalry. Now, the Georgians have no choice but to fight for them because they've been conquered and subjugated by the Mongols. But what the Mongols like doing is mixing Georgian lancers with their own mounted archers because they can make the combination work. So again, the Mongols are learning, they're adapting and evolving, which makes them all the more dangerous. And they're also hugely innovative. They work out different ways of conquering places. And one of the perhaps the most striking examples of this is when they besiege a town in the Caucasus, just north of the Caucasian Mountains. They can't get into the town. They haven't got any siege weapons. So they get lots and lots of livestock, animals. They take them under the castle walls and slaughter them, and then pile more dead animal carcasses on top of the dead ones until they build a ramp of dead animals, and they climb up the ramp and get into the town. Now, I'm not aware of any other civilization that's tried that, but it worked for the Mongols, even if it was an incredibly grisly way of doing it. So the Mongols do have this ability to acquire stratagems. And then perhaps overarching all these things is the biggest factor of all, which can be reduced to a single word. And that word is winning. When you win once, you become encouraged. When you win twice, you become very powerful and confident. When you win 100 times, you know in your heart no one is going to stop you. Now, there is a danger of overconfidence, but on balance, this seems to have been a major military asset, not just for you, but also because it means that your enemies also know that it's very, very hard to defeat you. And so they're backing off even as you're advancing, even before they can see you. They don't want to fight you because they know they're going to die. So why would they?
Just to picture this a little bit better, if you are a Knight Templar covered in this armor from head to toe and you have a big shield, what are arrows going to do? You may be slow, but I imagine these arrows are just like bouncing off of you and you just keep advancing until you reach your opponent.
Yeah. They'll bounce. A Knights Templar or Crusader Knight will have a padded jacket, a leather sort of tunic, then the chainmail, then a shield, and then there will be similarly a leather balaclava with a chainmail balaclava, and then a helmet on top. They're very, very heavily defended.
How much was this weighing, by the way?
Oh, I've no idea. A lot.
Okay, yeah.
So the rider is very heavily defended. But here's the thing. The horse isn't.
Right.
Horse armor begins to come in Western Europe in the late 12th century. and it becomes commonplace by the 13th. But there's plenty of horses that aren't armoured, and Mongol arrows will make short work of those. And it also has to be said that if you're hit with an arrow, and the Mongols' arrows hit really hard because their bows have got enormous draw weight to them, it's not just about penetrating the armour. I have heard one historian explain how the blunt trauma of being hit by an arrow, so just the sheer weight of the impact, that will be enough to rupture your internal organs, even if it doesn't pierce your armour.
Wow, okay.
Just the sheer impact of it, because of course your armour won't prevent a shockwave going into your body. The shockwave will pass through the armour. And it's for the same reason that when the Knights Templar fight, their Turkish opponents are often equipped with double-handed maces, because they've realised that the Templars' armour is too thick to be easily broken. So they don't try and break it, they just smash the Templar with a massive mace, and that will break up their internal organs and kill them with their armour intact.
I was also intrigued in the book by your observation that contrary to our usual perception, the Mongols actually didn't have an unlimited amount of soldiers. We imagined this giant, endless swarm that would just overwhelm simply on account of its mass. No, it was just that pretty much every man in their society was a warrior, unlike in, let's say, Christendom at the time, where pretty much every man was a farmer, and then only a tiny number of the elite were fighters.
Yeah, Mongol civilization's not that big. The Mongols managed to rule most of Eurasia with a total population probably no more than 2 or 3 million. That's just a guess, but it's small. Much smaller than the civilizations that they've conquered. But as you say, they're all fighters. And Mongol women also are trained to shoot and ride. They don't typically form part of the main field armies, but they can still fight if they need to. And it's the women who rule the Mongols' massive wagon cities. They're the ones who manage this enormous infrastructure and operation of Mongol society. And the wagon cities follow closely behind the armies, which means that once the Mongols have conquered an area, they can consolidate their control very quickly because their civilization moves directly behind them. But yeah, the Mongols' civilization is not that big. Their armies can be very big, but even with a Mongol army of, let's say, 100,000 troops, which by medieval standards is massive, they're still having to hold down tens of thousands of square miles of territory with comparatively few troops when compared to the size of the underlying population.
Okay, before we go back to the events in the Near East after the Mongols have arrived, I have to ask you this. I completely forgot before. There's another very fascinating agent on the map here, one that continues to be kind of the stuff of legends and is still intriguing enough to inspire a lot of pop culture today. I believe I've told you that I'm originally from Slovenia, and the most famous novel ever written by a Slovenian author, his name was Vladimir Bartol, was called Alamut, after a fortress. The book was also one of the main inspirations for the video game series Assassin's Creed. Both the novel and the video game obviously deal with the Nizaris, who are known for their ingenious use of assassins, some sort of super effective Middle Eastern ninjas of sorts. What's real and what's fiction here?
The Nizaris are a branch of Ismaili Shia Islam, and their roots go back a long time before the Mongols, well over a century, and they are intensively persecuted in the Middle East by the region's Sunni authorities. And the region's Sunni authorities are worried about them for two reasons. The first is that they seem to be very effective at winning new converts, but also because the way that they exert their influence is through, as you say, political assassination. And lots of leaders are very, very worried about this. For example, Saladin is so concerned about the dangers of being assassinated by the Nizaris that on campaign he spends his nights in a wooden tower which can be locked on the inside just to make sure no one can get in. And then outside that tower, there's a ring of soldiers, shoulder to shoulder. Outside that ring of soldiers is a second ring of soldiers. And even then, the assassins still almost managed to kill him twice.
Oh my God, you spend all this time and effort to become the Sultan, and then it's the opposite of fun. I mean, you have to sleep in a wooden tower.
Yeah, it's terrifying. And the Nizaris are very, very effective at what they do. Now, the Nizaris have two main centers. There's one center in northern Syria, and there's one center in northern Persia, northern Iran. And you're right, one of the main strongholds is called Alamut. And the Nizaris are a major faction in that sort of northern Iranian region for a long time. And there's even reports at one point of them reaching out, asking for help from the Mongols because, well, they've got enemies at home and the Mongols may not be as bad as their current enemies. So they're in an awkward position. But certainly by the time that we get to sort of the 1240s, 1250s, the Mongols see the Nizaris as an opponent. There are rumors in circulation that the Nizaris have said they're going to kill the Great Khan, which of course will not please the Mongols. And the third and final major wave of Mongol invasions into the Middle East takes place in 1252, when a new Great Khan called Monka sends his brother Hulagu into the Middle East with the biggest army yet. And his task is really to destroy everything that's left. And so in 1258, Hulagu destroys Baghdad. In 1260, Hulagu advances into Syria and takes Aleppo and Damascus and destroys the Ayyubid Empire. This is the final stages of the Mongols' third and most important set of invasions into the region. But before any of those conquests, the Mongols sack the Nizaris' strongholds in northern Iran, including Alamut. So yeah, this is a crucial moment for the Nizaris, and they never get to kill a Mongol senior leader.
Utterly fascinating. How is it possible to even sustain a tiny state or a kingdom with no army and simply with just a small sect of assassins, especially given the fact that they were surrounded, like you said, by these huge empires that in fact did have massive amount of troops?
So there are various things. There are various things that work in the Nizaris' favor. Assassination is obviously a major deterrent. Leave us alone, or we'll kill you. But also, before the Mongols arrive in the region, for a long period, for over a century, Persia, Iraq, Syria, these were all part of the Seljuk Empire. And I've mentioned the Seljuks a little earlier. They were a previous wave of invaders from Central Asia, and they created a massive empire for themselves across much of the Middle East. But from about 1100 onwards, all the way through to the Mongol invasions, the Seljuk Empire fell apart into smaller fragments, emirates and different governors and different contenders for power fighting amongst themselves. And even the Khwarezmian Empire, the Khwarezmians began life as Seljuk governors. So they're a symptom of that fragmentation. Now, the Nizaris can thrive in this environment because all the factions around them are so busy fighting each other that they're not fighting them. So that plus assassination means that they can survive. And the Nizaris also create for themselves these virtually impenetrable castles on the top of mountains. So they're very, very hard to reach. And they can just hold out against attackers for many years in some cases. And it's rare that a neighboring faction can hold an army together for long enough to besiege and overthrow one of their castles.
All right, let's get back to the main story, as it were. So at the end of the last episode, you explain how the Mongols subjugated the empire of the Seljuk Turks. And they don't seem like they were going to stop there, which must have flung all of these bordering Muslim and Christian states into a state of existential anxiety. What happens next?
Yeah, so as I said, the next wave is unleashed in 1252, and that's the one led by Hulagu. He conquers the assassins, Baghdad, Syria, overthrowing the Ayyubids, overthrowing the Abbasid Caliphate, overthrowing the Nizaris. And by this stage, the map of the Middle East is Mongol, basically. Much of the area is ruled directly by the Mongols, and what's left is basically client states. Armenia and Georgia, client states. Cilician Armenia, client state.
And these are kind of smaller kingdoms, smaller Christian kingdoms, right?
These are territories, whether Christian or Muslim, the Anatolian Seljuks are Muslim, who have agreed to acknowledge Mongol overlordship.
Right. But these are not like empires or like big kingdoms.
Well, the Anatolian Seljuks are pretty big, but they've been invaded in 1243. Right.
Yeah.
The Byzantines also submit around this time, and they've tried to string out their negotiations with the Mongols for a very long time, but they see this isn't going to work. They submit in the 1260s in this invasion, and so the map of the Middle East by this stage contains only two groups of powers that are still independent. One group is the Crusader States. Now, the Crusader States consist of three states. The Principality of Antioch, which did submit to the Mongols in 1260, and further south, the County of Tripoli and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And they're tiny. They have no chance against the Mongols. Their response to the Mongols, who are now on their frontier, is to try and negotiate. And it seems as if they're hoping that by being friendly with the Mongols, they can avoid the need to actually submit. It's a fairly forlorn hope, but that's what they're trying to do. And the final empire is Egypt. Now, this requires a little bit of explanation because Egypt previously was ruled by the Ayyubid Empire, that Saladin's dynasty, but it's not anymore. And the reason for that is that the Ayyubids, during the 13th century, purchased large numbers of young men as enslaved people. And they could purchase enslaved people in large numbers, particularly from the Black Sea region, because the Mongols were selling them by the tens of thousands. The Mongols are conquering the entire area, rounding people up, taking them to the Crimea and selling them as enslaved people to whoever wants to buy them. And the Egyptians buy lots of them, the Ayyubids. And so these enslaved people are brought in, they are trained to become elite warriors, and then they fight in the Ayyubid army. But there comes a tipping point when these regiments of enslaved people, called Mamluk regiments, when those Mamluk regiments become a little bit too big, a little bit too powerful, and they begin to realize that they don't have to follow orders at all. In fact, they're more powerful than anyone else. And so in 1250, while there's another major crusade going on in Egypt, the Seventh Crusade, the Mamluks very much are among those who win this campaign and defeat the crusading army. And immediately after the defeat of the crusading army, the Mamluks execute or murder the reigning sultan. And then soon afterwards, they take power for themselves to create one of the most extraordinary states of the medieval era, the Mamluk Sultanate. And it's extraordinary because it's a sultanate ruled by enslaved people, ruled by the Mamluks. But the Mamluks are exceptionally capable warriors. And what makes them so interesting is that they are from Central Asia themselves. Because when the Mongols conquered Central Asia and before they sold these people in sort of northern coast of the Black Sea region, they had been raised as nomadic steppe nomads. So their culture and way of life and their warcraft is the same as the Mongols, except that being centered in Egypt, they have access to enormous wealth. So they can afford the best horses, the best equipment, etc. And this is the remaining empire. This is the last real bastion of true military strength in the Middle East in 1260 when the Mongols arrive in the region.
It reminds me of the Janissaries later on in the Ottoman Empire, no? that were also kind of extracted from, I don't know, the Balkans and then brought into modern day Turkey and then made into these elite soldiers that had a lot of power.
It's quite common among Middle Eastern empires of this era, particularly sort of Turkish sultanates or emirates, to have, I mean, the slave trade is everywhere in the Middle East, but the idea of having specific enslaved people as warriors, that's very common in many empires from this era.
How come the forces of Western Christendom never launched a crusade against the Mongols, particularly if these small Crusader states were threatened, like the Kingdom of Jerusalem, for example?
Okay, so they do. They do in Eastern
against the
Europe,
Mongols directly
against the Mongols. So when the Mongols invade Hungary and Poland, the Pope launches a crusade against them. But although crusading forces do begin to gather, the crusading forces arrive in Hungary after the Mongols have already left. They're not fast enough, basically. But for much of the later 13th century, what's left of Christendom's defences in Eastern Europe, there are a lot of crusading indulgences. That indulgences is where the papacy offers remission of sins. So you're freed from your sins if you fight in holy war. Lots of indulgences are offered to the remaining defenders of Eastern Europe, the idea being to build up Eastern Europe's defences as much as possible in case the Mongols come back. Now, they came back as raiders occasionally. There's a brief flurry of invasions, but there's no war of conquest, but they don't know that. So the papacy does work very hard to build up defences in Eastern Europe. In the Middle East, there's not really an attempt to launch a crusade against the Mongols. And perhaps the reasons that, just if I could sort of bring the story forward a little bit, then I can explain why. Because the Mamluks, they do not have a particularly large army. They're very powerful. They're very good warriors. But they can probably manage about 12,000 troops. Now, the Mongol invasion army into Syria in 1260 under Hulagu is about 100,000 strong. And this is where the Mamluks do something a little bit strange. It's something that no one else did. And that is that they don't wait to be attacked. Now, normally, the way that other empires or kingdoms or sultanates respond to the Mongols is they do one of two things. They submit to the Mongols and therefore avoid being invaded, or they conduct diplomacy with the Mongols, and when that diplomacy fails, they build up their defences and try and defend their borders when the Mongols attack. But the Mamluks do something completely different. The Mongols send emissaries to the Mamluks, submit to us or we'll kill you, and the Mamluks execute the Mongol emissaries and shave the beards from the ones they spare, which is an enormous insult, massive insult.
Usually not a good move, as we've discovered in the previous episode.
Well, unless you are determined to resist, because if you do that, from that point, every single person in the Mamluk Empire knows that there can be no negotiation.
Game on.
The only thing you can do now is fight, because the Mongols won't care what you say. They won't care if you submit. The level of insult you've offered means that you have to defend yourself, you have to fight, or the Mongols will kill all of you. And there is no other course of action here at all. But the Mamluks don't wait to be attacked. They gather their armies and march out to attack the Mongols, even as the Mongols are attacking. And there are various Mamluk emirs who are saying that this is obviously suicide. But nonetheless, it's what they do. And so they march out to fight the Mongols. And this is where events work out in their favour, because the Mongols aren't used to being attacked. They're the ones who attack. They're not attacked themselves. And so they don't take many precautions against this kind of situation. Now, at this moment, the great Khan in Mongolia dies. And so his brother, Hulagu, has a strong incentive to get back to Mongolia quickly, or at least to be close, to make sure his voice is heard for who's going to be the next Mongol great Khan. So just as the Mamluks are gathering their armies to attack, Hulagu leaves the Middle East, or he moves eastwards not the Middle East, he leaves Syria into Azerbaijan to be closer to what's happening in terms of the Mongol succession. And he leaves behind a garrison of 20,000 troops in Syria to hold the area. And what the Mamluks don't know this, but the Mamluks advance first to the Crusader States. And they say to the rulers of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, fight with us against the Mongols.
Pretty reasonable.
It's reasonable. And of course, this is by no means the first time that Muslims and Crusaders have worked together. This happened many times. So it's not unusual. And the Kingdom of Jerusalem plays a cautious game. The rulers of the Kingdom of Jerusalem say to the Mamluks, we'll provide you with food and we'll sell you horses. So we will assist you. But we won't fight alongside you because we don't think you're going to win. But you can see they're trying to sort of hedge their bets.
Also pretty reasonable.
They can say
given the state of things. Yeah.
If the Mongols win, the Mongols say, we had nothing to do with it. And the Mamluks, the Mamluks then move on from the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and it's then that they attack the Mongols near Lake Tiberias. That's the Sea of Galilee. And there's a battle between the Mamluk army and the Mongol garrison of 20,000 troops, which the Mamluks win at a battle called Ain Jalut. It's commonly considered to be one of the most important battles in history, and it sort of is. But, of course, for the Mamluks, this is a tremendous victory. They've defeated the Mongols, celebration, all the rest of it.
Just for clarification, they didn't defeat the entire 100,000 strong army, just the garrison.
No, just the garrison. But as you've already picked up, there is a problem with this victory, which is that, of course, the Mongols, as soon as they learn what's happened, Hulagu swears rapid revenge with the full weight of his army. So you could say, well, the Mamluks, their only achievement is to provoke the Mongols to see them as their primary enemy and to focus all their energies onto defeating the Mamluks. And so this is the crucial moment. The Mamluks are the only state left in the Middle East strong enough to fight the Mongols, and the Mongols have sworn that they will attack the Mamluks. It's the turning point of the whole thing. But there's another process at work here. And this is that when the Mongols conquer parts of the world, the various different imperial families in the Mongol Empire, and those families are the descendants of the various sons of Chinggis Khan. So Chinggis Khan had several sons, and Tuloy and Jebi and Ogadai, various others, and they all have their own dynasty attached to them. And the Mongol Empire is divided up into different zones of jurisdiction owned by various different families. So, for example, much of what we would call Russia and Eastern Europe is in the area of jurisdiction, or Ulu as they were known, of Jebi and Jebi's sons. The Middle East is also part of Jebi's Ulu. Jebi, or to be more precise, Jebi's descendants by this point consider the Middle East to be part of their jurisdiction. But when Hulagu conquered the region, he's from a different Ulu, a different imperial family. And so the Golden Horde, as Jebi's descendants are known, they demand that Hulagu acknowledges that they are overlords to the Middle East. Hulagu has to recognize this is their territory. This is their part of the Mongol Empire. He has no right to call this part of the Middle East his own empire. They own it, so he has to acknowledge that he rules at their favor. But he refuses to do this. He refuses to acknowledge the Ulu of Jebi, or the Golden Horde's overlordship. He even executes various commanders from that Ulu, and so it's going to be war. It's going to be war between the Golden Horde in the north, Jebi's Ulu, and Hulagu's territory in the Middle East that he's conquered, which becomes known as the Ilkhanate. And so just as Hulagu is swearing revenge on the Mamluks, and just as the Golden Horde is preparing to re-invade Hungary and Poland and Western Christendom, they go to war with each other.
Another lucky break.
A lucky break for the Mamluks. Lucky break for Western and Eastern for Western Christendom. And so for much of the next 20 years, the Golden Horde, Jebbi's Ulu, and Hulagu's Ilkhanate in the south, they're fighting each other in the Caucasus. And that means that it's almost over 20 years before an army attacks the Mamluk Empire, because they're so busy and caught up with their own disputes. And so in the interim period, in that 20-year period, the Mamluks build up their trade, build up their defenses. They massively fortify the line of the Euphrates River. They expand their army, and they train their army by breaking down what's left of the Crusader States. So in the 1260s, while the Mongols are fighting each other, the Mamluks are pulling down all the Crusader castles, all the Crusader cities, until by around 1280, there's only a few left. And that's when the Mongols re-invade. And a much more significant battle takes place, more significant in my opinion anyway, at the Battle of Homs, when the Mamluks meet the full strength of the Mongol field army, which is thought to have been between 60 and 80,000 troops. The Mamluks have about 30,000 troops, and the Mamluks do manage to defeat the Mongols. And so that, in my view, that's the turning point battle, because the Mamluks meet the Mongols at full strength and defeat them.
That's pretty impressive, I'm not going to lie. But if we can turn our attention to sort of the internal dynamics of these Mongol empires, now it's not just one. One extremely interesting thing that is perhaps counterintuitive was their, as you write in the book, sustained interest in the pursuit of science and learning. So when the Mongols conquered a city, they often spared the artisans and especially the intellectuals, even when they slaughtered everyone else. Not exactly a policy we would necessarily, again, associate with the so-called brute conquerors. Yeah. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so again, I'm going to repeat what I said previously, which is the Mongols are exceptionally violent, but they're also highly organized. It's not just a horde of barbarians. It's not like that at all.
I know, but also intellectuals will not exactly help you advance your military goals necessarily, right? Like theologians or astronomers.
Well, the Mongols think they will.
Okay, so it's more pragmatic than that. Okay.
Yeah,
fine.
So the Mongols want people who can be useful to them. So as you quite rightly say, when the Mongols conquer a city, they'll kill everyone except for the high quality artisans. So if you're a really good goldsmith or textile worker, or if you're really good at raising horses or you manufacture weapons, you will be spared. Your family won't, but you will be spared. You will be taken to another part of the Mongol Empire where you'll be set to work practicing your trade, because the Mongols can see it's useful, and the Mongols are interested in trade. Their initial invasions cause a huge amount of disruption to trade, but they're very keen to recover that trade as fast as possible soon afterwards, because like every single civilization that I've ever read about, they want to acquire as much money as possible. How many exceptions are there to that kind, to empires not wanting to have large amounts of money? But the Mongols, as you say, they're also interested in intellectuals, theologians, religious leaders, and what they want from them. Again, they're very practical in what they want. They want people to discover how to make alchemy work. And why wouldn't you? What government wouldn't want the ability to turn iron into gold? I mean, you would be unstoppable. Now, we know that's not possible scientifically. They don't know that. It hasn't been worked out yet. No, and lots of civilizations in Eurasia think that alchemy is possible. So that's one task. Another thing that they want, particularly from astrologers, so people who can read the signs in the stars, is they are working in the belief that astrology can genuinely tell the future. And again, what government wouldn't want people who can tell the future accurately for them. And the Mongols believe that astrologers can do that for them. So they want people who can do that. And at this point, astrology is deemed to be a serious science, like physics and biology and chemistry would be for us today. And the other thing the Mongols want from medical experts is anything that can extend the life and prosperity of the Mongols' imperial family. Because, again, who wouldn't want to live double, 3 times a normal human lifespan? Now, today we know that with the technology even that we have today, that's not possible. But they don't know that. And so they want people who can research these things. And many of the scientists they manage to gather together, and these scientists can be from all the way across Eurasia, they set them these tasks. And of course, these scientists and philosophers and medical experts, many of them know that they can't do these things, but they're not stupid. They're not going to say they can't do them. So as a result, the Mongols create research institutions. The most famous one is at a place called Moraga. And the Mongols pour resources onto this place. It has a huge, great observatory for looking at the stars and a library and other facilities because the Mongols want these things researched. And I'm not quite sure what the various scientists there did, but they managed to keep the Mongols happy enough to keep the thing going for quite a long time.
That's crazy. They established some sort of proto-NASA of their own at that time.
And it's interesting because genuine scientific advances did take place there. So, for example, there's one philosopher called Nasir al-Din Tusi, and he made significant advances in spherical trigonometry. So things that have actually informed the wider progress of science did take place there. Mongols had no use for spherical trigonometry, but they took place there anyway.
Speaking of the Mongols wanting to extend their lives a little bit, I had to laugh when reading your book because a lot of the time you write that the Khans died in some sort of alcoholic stupor. So I'm guessing they weren't like listening to their doctors that much. And also they seem to have a pretty rough lifestyle, mildly put.
So, yes, the traditional Mongol lifestyle is quite tough. It involves moving.
Even if you're a Khan.
Even if you're a leader, yeah. So the traditional lifestyle, it means moving from winter to summer grazing. You're in the saddle every day. You have to cope with extremes of temperature and weather and rain. And it's a tough lifestyle. And they don't eat very much either. They eat occasional meat. They don't tend to eat their animals. They might kill sort of deer or bush marmots or things like that, local animals, but they tend to keep their own animals for their hides or for their milk. But they don't eat a great deal. They'll sometimes bloodlet their animals and mix the blood with meat or with other ingredients to make a nourishing food. But it's thin. It's not much to go with. But from a military perspective, that makes them all the more powerful because they can survive on very, very little. And that includes their leaders. But once the Mongols have started to conquer empires or massive areas of civilization, like China or Persia, then the lifestyle becomes a lot more complicated and a lot more luxurious. And so they do start to wear enormously fashionable clothing. And they do have tents that can accommodate 2,000 people. And they live in palaces. And they start to look and act and behave much more like opulent rulers rather than tough nomads from the Central Asian steppe. And just to give you an idea of how far this went, emissaries to the Mongol court observed that on each different day of the week, the Mongol court wore different clothes. So today we'll wear red clothes, and tomorrow we'll wear clothes of a different colour. So
everybody at court.
Everyone. Because they all have the wealth to afford a huge array of clothing. So they're living lifestyles more luxurious than anyone. These are imperial nomads now. They're not sort of nomads from the Central Asian steppe. And the fashions the Mongols create are so influential that even in weird, far away, distant, remote and foreign places like the Kingdom of England, Mongol ambassadors create a massive fashion stir. And when the Mongol ambassadors arrive in these places, people start to want to dress like them because they're setting the style for the whole of Eurasia.
What about the unholy amounts of boozing? Was that always there? Because there's a lot of kumis. I don't know if I pronounced that right, in the book.
So the Mongols drink a lot, and it's part of their culture. And in fact, it gets very frustrating for one Franciscan friar called William of Rubruck from France, because he goes to the Mongol Empire hoping to convert the Mongols. And the Mongols say to him, we have heard that if we convert to Christianity, we can no longer drink kumis, which is fermented mare's milk. And William says, no, there's no problem with that at all. Of course you can carry on drinking kumis. But the Mongols refuse to believe him. So he's very frustrated because he can't convert them to Christianity, even though there's no actual block on converting to Christianity. But the Mongols believe there's a block, so they don't convert. Or the ones he speaks to don't anyway. But yeah, the Mongols love kumis, fermented mare's milk. And when it's the season for producing it, they produce it in huge quantities and they have it at their feasts and their banquets. It's quite nutritious. You get a lot of calories from it, so it can be quite healthy. I can't say I've tried it myself, although perhaps I probably should. But it's not the only alcohol they try. And of course, as they conquer other parts of the world, they acquire tastes for other alcoholic drinks as well, particularly rice wine. But there's no awareness that alcohol is there's only some awareness, I should say, that alcohol is really, really bad for you if consumed in extreme quantities. And so, yes, many Mongol Khans and Mongol leaders do die from alcohol poisoning or alcohol-related poisoning.
Yet another fascinating policy, very surprising indeed, of the Mongols was relative religious tolerance. Would you believe that? I was really, really shocked when I was reading this. Now, the Mongols had their own theology. We talked about it in the first episode, but they believed that as long as you kind of didn't interfere with that, you could basically do your own thing, whether you were a Muslim, a Christian, or something else. I mean, that is pretty astonishing, especially if we compare that with the fanaticism of medieval Europe, for example.
Yeah, no, it's not common anywhere that you'll get tolerance on that level. But the Mongols have some interesting ideas here. As you say, they've got their own religious beliefs, and those religious beliefs are supreme. So the Mongol right to rule the world, that is a belief that encompasses all the rest of the world, including all other religions. So anyone within the Mongol Empire has to accept that, whatever else they believe. But that aside, as you say, they're quite tolerant. And the Mongols have a theology which was explained to one Western European envoy by the great Khan Monka. And Monka held up his hand and said, right, so you have all the different religions of the world, and they're like fingers on a hand. They're different, but they're all connected. That's a very interesting thing by itself to say that, but my interpretation on that has always been, and they're all connected to the palm, which is the Mongols' beliefs. So they're all sort of offshoots of the central idea of the Mongol Empire. I've interpreted that a little bit, but that's always been my sense. Because the Mongols have no difficulty with other religions. So, for example, when the Mongols demand the submission of a Christian power, they will embroider their demands for submission with passages from the Bible, because their beliefs encompass those of the Bible. So the Bible is a holy book for them too, because it's within their broader umbrella of religion.
Kind of meta-religion.
In a sense, yeah. And when the Mongols ask Muslim powers to submit, they will embroider their demands with passages from the Quran. And this is not a problem for them. It's all part of their beliefs as they see them. And so as a result, they're not going to persecute people for having other faiths, because they consider them all to be within their broader religious framework. And in fact, it's in this era that you actually have a growing and a reasonably large Buddhist community in the Middle East. Never really been there before, not in numbers, but a Buddhist community grows in the Middle East under Mongol rule. It doesn't last for long once the Mongols move on from these beliefs onto other religions, but nonetheless. And so it is extraordinary that there is this practice of religious tolerance, but it's tolerance within the Mongols' existing beliefs. You can't contradict what the Mongols do believe. That's not going to work. But as I mentioned earlier, the Mongols, rather like intellectuals or artisans, they also want to gather together religious leaders, because the Mongols believe that whether you are a religious leader from Islam, Buddhism, Judaism, any religion basically, you still have access to religious power. You still have some kind of religious power, and the Mongols want these religious leaders to use their religious power for the betterment of the Mongol Empire, just as they want weaponsmiths to make weapons for them or astrologers to predict the future. They view them in practical terms as people who can do stuff to advance the Mongol Empire and its cause.
The title of your book, as we already said, is The Mongol Storm. And as scary as a storm can be, the fact is it always ends, as you already hinted. What happened after the Mamluks defeated the Mongols at full strength?
Yeah, so the Mongol Empire really begins to encounter trouble after this. And for the next 20 years, really, so Ain Jalut, that was the first battle where the Mamluks defeated that Mongol garrison. That's 1260. Then Homs is where they defeated the Mongols at full strength. The Mongols, again, won't return to the Middle East in really large numbers, or won't try and attack the Mamluk Empire, I should say, for another 20 years. And the reason it takes so long is they're fighting amongst themselves. They're fighting the Golden Horde, so the rival branch of the Mongol Empire to the north of the Black Sea, or they're fighting other powers further east. So they're caught up with their own affairs, and there are also the beginnings of rebellions against Mongol rule, which again tie up their forces. So during that period, the Mamluks develop their defenses even more. Their armies get even bigger. And it's in this last period, so between 1280 and 1299, that the Mamluks destroy the Crusader States in their entirety. Essentially, they're training their armies on destroying Crusader castles in preparation for an invasion that they know is coming from the Mongols. And so in 1291, with the fall of Acre, the last remains of the Crusader States fall, and the Mamluks destroy the mainland Crusader States. But the battles for the end of the Crusader States are not some epic confrontation, not some massive titanic duel. The Mamluks are just knocking over Crusader castles to train their forces and build up their territories while waiting for their main opponent, who are the Mongols. But yes, the Mongols do come back in 1299. And on this occasion, the Mongols win. And so it's very interesting to see what happens next. So the Mongols invade under Sultan Ghazan in 1299. He's the main Mongol leader. Sultan Ghazan, the leader of the Ilkhanate, advances into Syria, crosses the Euphrates border, defeats the Mamluks to the north of Damascus, and then takes Damascus. And so he has the Mamluk Empire at bay. He's in a position to conquer the Mamluk Empire in its entirety. And it's really interesting. He doesn't do it. And historians have been rather puzzled by this. Why did he not do it? Why did he not extend his conquests and defeat his long-standing opponent after all these years? And it's one quite interesting comment is made by a Knights Templar observer who was present in the Middle East and at least picked up rumors of what was going on. He said it's quite simple. The Mongols can't graze their horses in the area. And so perhaps a little bit like I mentioned in the previous podcast with
Eastern Europe. Yeah.
It's the environment that defeats the Mongols, not armies. Because if they can't graze their animals, their civilization can't move. And as I mentioned in the previous podcast too, the Mongols encountered exactly the same problem in Southeast Asia when they tried to cross into jungle territory. They can't do it. So perhaps it's the desert or the more arid landscapes of southern Syria that defeated the Mongols rather than anything else. I also think it may be because the Mongols were quite a long way beyond their own frontier by this point, and so they couldn't sustain themselves so far from home. But the Mamluk Empire survives, not because it defeated the Mongols, but because the Mongols couldn't make their conquests permanent. In fact, a few decades after this, in 1323, the Mongols and Mamluks create a peace treaty, and that's the end of the fighting.
You write that the Mongols ultimately accelerated the process of Islamization of the Near East, even though, like we explored before, they were shamanistic when they first started conquering this region. However, the Mongols could choose from many different religions, monotheistic or otherwise. How come they didn't choose Christianity or Buddhism, for example?
Sure. It seems as if some Mongol leaders did, but you're right. In the long term in the Middle East, the Mongols convert to Islam.
Because you just said there was a sultan that came over at the end and could have conquered the Mamluk Empire and then chose it. He didn't. So I did pick that up. So if he was a sultan, he was probably Muslim, right?
Yes. By this point, the Mongols are at a fairly early stage in their conversion to Islam, but Sultan Ghazan is Islamic, and he is the ruler of the Mongol Ilkhanates. So by this point, the Mongols are very much converting. But it goes something like this, that when the Mongols conquered a region, that the most effective way, if you have been conquered by the Mongols but you have survived, the most effective way to survive under Mongol rule is not to try anything silly, like build an army and try and resist the Mongols on the battlefield, a sort of Hollywood sort of, we suffered enough, we'll fight against the oppressor. That will not work. You'll just be destroyed. The people who are effective in rebelling against the Mongols are people who go to the Mongol Empire after they've been conquered with a big smile on their face. And they say, you were right to conquer us. We deserved it. You have taught us better morality as a result of this. Lots of societies try this. And having said that, they then try and make themselves useful to the Mongols. We'll run your regions. We'll run your cities. We'll gather your taxes, and we'll do it well. Now, who wouldn't accept that kind of offer? And so much of the bureaucracy of the Mongol Empire is carried out by local administrators who have agreed to work with the Mongols and are making themselves useful. And then you can go one stage further. Having made themselves useful, they might say to the Mongols, why don't we act as tutors for your children? Why don't we act as advisors for your rulers? Now, the various people who are offering themselves as administrators or bureaucrats to the Mongols, they're not doing it out of kindness and generosity. They're doing it because they want to work their way up the Mongol hierarchies, because the more useful they make themselves, the more they can steer Mongol policy. And so at an early stage, they might be able to say, well, from our community, we're really loyal to you. So why don't you leave us alone? But our next door neighbors, who we've always hated, they're troublemakers. Why don't you do something about that? And so they can steer the Mongols in that way. But of course, what they're really after is if you can get yourself into a position where you are acting as tutor or educator for leading the children of leading Mongols, perhaps you can steer them to hold your beliefs. And the conversion of a leading Mongol to your religious beliefs, that is a major win. And everyone's trying it. Buddhists, Christians, Muslims, they're all trying it. They're all trying to persuade the Mongols to convert to their faith. And in the Middle East, the Mongols do convert to Islam in the long term. Now, there are examples of previous to this of Mongols who seem to show a leaning towards Buddhism or Christianity, but in the long term, they convert towards Islam. But what's interesting is that even when the Mongols are converted to Islam, that doesn't mean that they become natural friends of the Mamluk Empire. The Mamluks immediately denounce them as being not proper Muslims. They're not
heretics.
And the Mongols themselves, they hold a lot of their shamanistic beliefs at the same time as their Islamic beliefs, and they mix them together. So the Mamluks still very much do not accept them. And they have a reason to do this, because what they really don't want is for the Mamluk armies to say, well, why are we fighting fellow Muslims? They want to make sure their armies remain motivated to fight the Mongols. And so there are various reasons for doing this. But yeah, the fighting carries on. But the Mongol Empire does become steadily more, it becomes more and more Islamic as the 13th and 14th century go on.
Kind of funny, because when our pal, what was his name, Rubric, was visiting them and trying to convert them to Christianity, they were like, nah, because we can't drink anymore and we love our booze. And then they convert to Islam, which explicitly prohibits drinking. So I'm wondering what you.
Sorry. I'm not sure what happened there in terms of how that thinking sort of developed. But yeah, it's not something that seems to have formed a block for the Mongol conversion to Islam. Yeah.
In the book, you also detail how they kind of figured out that if they convert to Islam, that will give them a bit of an advantage, I believe, in recruiting in certain areas or something like this. And they already had this proximity to these Turkic warriors and tribes in the way of living. And that also kind of eased this conversion.
Yes, so about 2 centuries before the Mongols invaded, the Middle East had another major invasion out of Central Asia, led by the Seljuk Turks. And the Seljuk Turks were very, very similar to the Mongols in their origins, at least. They were shamanistic from Central Asia. They invaded the Middle East. And in fact, one observer commented that the way to tell a difference between a Mongol and a Turk is the Mongols tie up their robes on one side of their body and the Seljuks tie up their robes on the other.
Oh, they were that similar?
They're that similar. And so the Seljuks, after their invasions that started in about the year 1000, the Seljuks slowly convert to Islam over the next 2 centuries. And so by the time the Mongols invade, they have fully converted to Islam. So the Mongols are invading a region where there are lots and lots of Turkish peoples who are very similar to them, who have already converted to Islam, but who are very sort of natural allies and natural to sort of join the Mongol Empire once the Mongols have conquered the Middle East. And so you might well say, well, perhaps the Mongols sort of followed in the footsteps of the Seljuk Turks, particularly as the descendants of the Seljuk Turks then joined into the Mongol Empire, providing a very natural source of influence and the sharing of ideas and theologies.
As we've seen, empires are always rising and falling, and the fall of the Mongols was the rise of the Mamluks in Egypt, and perhaps even more interesting, especially for me, since I'm from the Balkans, for a very young power that would define this region for pretty much the next 500 to 600 years, and that was, of course, the Ottoman Empire. How did the Mongols ultimately cause, at the time, these scattered Turkmen nomads to finally unite after pretty much, 2-3 centuries of aimless discord?
Yeah, so when the Mongols invaded the Middle East, naturally there were tens, hundreds of thousands of people who moved westwards to get out of the way. Some took refuge in the Mamluk Empire, some took refuge in the Crusader States, but basically they're trying to go anywhere that will get them away from the Mongols. And among their numbers are tens, possibly hundreds of thousands of Turkish nomads. Now, Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, was already and had been for 2 centuries a major site of migration for Turkish nomads moving out of Central Asia and ending up in the central Anatolian plateau and areas of flat grazing ground in the middle of Anatolia, and then around the periphery of that as well. And in that area, of course, they then have a frontier with the Byzantine Empire. Now, the Mongols conquered Turkey, as it became known, but the Turkmen nomads never submitted, or they may have done so temporarily, but never in the long term. And so the Mongols, they drive, inadvertently perhaps, or due to their invasions, huge numbers of Turkmen nomads into Anatolia, try and force them to submit, but they don't. And as soon as the Mongols relax their grip in Anatolia, even for a moment, the Turkmen rebel. And so you have a situation where you have the Mongols trying to enforce their control, and the Turkmen nomads, when the Mongols are really trying to sort of send armies into the region, they may get out of the way, or they might fight. But as soon as the Mongols relax their attention, even for a moment, they rebel again. And so you have a cycle of rebellion after rebellion after rebellion against Mongol rule. And the Turkmen groupings get bigger and bigger, often centered on a single city. And they become known as Turkmen Beyliks. And there are lots of Turkmen Beyliks. There's the Turkmen Beylik of Karaman, for example, or there's the Turkmen Beylik of Smyrna, or Aydin, among others, as many of them, and they change all the time. But among the various families displaced by the Mongols, forced westwards, and which put down roots in northwestern Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, is a family called the Ottomans. And these are the origins of the Ottoman Empire. And many of these Beyliks, not so much the Ottomans in this early period, they are instrumental in forcing the Mongol invasions to come to a halt. And so it's interesting that in so many cases, it's peoples displaced by the Mongols, whether that's the Turkmen in Anatolia or the Mamluks, who of course were originally people displaced and sold as enslaved people to Egypt. It's peoples who are displaced or sold by the Mongols who ultimately forced the Mongol invasions and conquests to stop.
Also kind of reminiscent of Mongol beginnings, no? These different nomadic beyliks that become bigger and bigger until they become one big state is how the Mongols actually started, isn't it?
It'll take the Ottomans 100 years to fully gain control over.
They don't have their own Genghis Khan.
Yeah, it takes them a long time, and they've got various problems themselves. But by the time we get to the Mongols re-invade under the Emir Timur in the 14th century, but that goes way beyond what we're talking about today. But yeah, ultimately the Ottomans do conquer all the Beyliks and the Byzantine Empire, and as is well known, from there they expand, whether that's into Syria, Egypt, the Balkans, many other parts of the world.
Yeah, I hope your next book is about the rise of the Ottoman Empire, because we got to keep this story going. You know, this is too good to just stop here. That makes no sense. By the way, one conclusion that you make at the end of the book is that because of the Mongol invasions, the Europeans get a much better understanding of the enormous scale of the lands that lay in the east, something they had no idea about previously. No more Prester John here. And of course, it wasn't just about the lands, it was about the riches these lands contained. Now, you don't say this in the book, this is maybe a bit far-fetched, but would you perhaps say that we can trace the mindset of later European colonialism to this sort of expanded awareness?
Yes, I kind of hint at it in my conclusion. The Mongol Empire is more... It changes, obviously, many more things than just the Mongol civilization itself. It profoundly influences the Chinese civilization and the Islamic world and Byzantium. And it also influences Western Europe. It influences Western Europe in a number of ways. Firstly, the Mongols play their part in spreading gunpowder technology to all various different parts of Eurasia. And obviously, cannon, guns will play their part in Western European and the rise of Western European empires. Also, the practice of trying to support the Crusader States leads Western Europe to build much, much bigger ships than it ever had done previously. And of course, many European empires depend on large ships and the ability to carry large numbers of people over great distances. But the Mongols play their part in this too for another reason, which is that prior to this, Western Europe knew virtually nothing about Asia. It knew from the Crusades about the area around Jerusalem. It had some idea of the area to the west of the Tigris River, perhaps, of modern-day northern Iraq. There may be some distant memories from the Viking traders who traded as far east as Uzbekistan, but the memory there is pretty thin. It doesn't really know what's much further east than that. But due to the Mongols and people going to the Mongols to conduct diplomacy, like John of Piano Carpini, who I mentioned previously, or the friar, William of Rubruck, or the merchant, Marco Polo, as is famously known, they travelled enormous distances too. China, parts of Eurasia that had never been visited before by European travellers. And then they came back and they wrote down what they had seen. And what they had seen was enormous riches and millions of people who weren't Christians. And so that then sets up a series of ambitions that will carry out in later centuries. There's a huge amount of money out there. Perhaps there is the potential for very lucrative trade, in time, conquest. By exploring all these places, perhaps another route will be opened up to reach Jerusalem, which of course is a major preoccupation for Western Christendom. Maybe Jerusalem can be approached from another angle. Now, we know now, on a basis of the map, you've got to cross the Pacific if you want to go all the way around the world and approach Jerusalem from another dimension. But they're discovering these things. They don't know that in Western Europe. And then, of course, there is the idea that, of course, maybe missionaries could go out and try and win converts from these other cultures. So the experience of conducting diplomacy and trade with the Mongols wakes up, it draws Western Europe's attention to a much wider world at the same time that technologies are being developed or reaching Western Europe, which could then facilitate the creation of overseas empires. Now, we're talking about very dim and distant origins of, say, the massive empires of the modern era, but perhaps we are looking at some of the seeds that would ultimately create those empires.
When we talked about the Crusades, I couldn't help but mentioning Kingdom of Heaven, the movie, which you weren't too impressed by. Is there any sort of like TV show or movie about the Mongols that's pretty good?
I have to confess, I don't tend to watch them. I know that there's a series on Marco Polo, but I'm afraid I haven't watched it.
Okay,
Sorry.
no, that's terrible. I've seen that one. That's
okay.
Please don't watch that. There's like a blind kung fu master that's always fighting 200 people, and he's teaching Marco Polo how to do kung fu, and that's like one of the biggest parts of the show. It was pretty silly.
I see, but no, I mean, for the most part, I find
too heartbreaking for a historian to watch those, I suppose.
It's no fun watching TV with me when we're watching historical stuff and with, I don't know, friends or family, because I start complaining and no one wants that. That's wrong. That's wrong. No one wants that.
Yeah, I've heard there was a Russian movie about Genghis Khan, but I haven't seen it. I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, whatever. For the end, provocative question. Do you think we can learn from history? In the previous episode, we were kind of talking about, how these various kingdoms were preparing for the Mongol invasion, and we found out that they weren't preparing at all, meaning they didn't form any sort of big coalitions with each other, even though they were facing an existential threat. Do you think we've gotten a little bit better in this, or not at all?
I think the human condition, I mean, you can see, I'm not sure we are better in ways than previous human generations in previous centuries. I think that the human condition is fairly similar. But there are some things that I think can be said. And that is that what we're looking at in the Middle East at the time of the Mongol invasions is a chaotic landscape, a landscape where you have no security. You have no idea whether you, your family, your community will survive for tomorrow, let alone next year. It's highly unstable. No one knows what the future holds. There's so much fighting, so much violence on so many different fronts that you have to live from day to day very carefully, and making future plans is very difficult. And I think that that's something that's very important, because we live in a world, many of us do today, in a world that is very, very stable. Or it has been very, very stable. And so, for example, in parts of Europe, societies have been stable. There's been very little fighting or upheaval in many parts of Europe for decades. Now, obviously, there are exceptions. Ukraine would be an obvious one. But for many of us, complete stability throughout our entire lives has been taken for granted. It's just normal. And we make our decisions around a very stable environment. We make decisions fairly slowly. We gather evidence. We make sensible choices. We change our approaches incrementally. We get lots of different people's opinions to make our choices, because this is decision making that pays well when things are stable. Now, in the Middle East in the 13th century, things were not stable. And I would say that the countries or the cultures or states that behaved most like we would now are those that said, okay, the Mongols are approaching. Let's gather information on them. Okay, the Mongols are closer now. Let's conduct diplomacy with them and see what they want and see if we can negotiate something with them. The Mongols are even closer. Okay, we'll build up our defenses so we can protect ourselves. And then the Mongols invade. Now, every single country that adopted that course of action was destroyed. But that's also a course of action that today in the 21st century, most of us would see as being very, very logical, very sensible. But they all got destroyed. The cultures and the countries and regions that survived best were those who submitted really, really early. So, for example, the Kingdom of Silesia submitted long before the Mongols were within several hundred miles of their borders. They submitted really early, and the Mongols appreciated that and gave them preferential treatment. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the Mamluks, who were more aggressive than anyone else, and they survived better than anyone else. And I think that within this, there is food for thought about the way that people make decisions in safe environments, secure environments, and in chaotic environments. Because the decisions that seem to work in safe environments are not the same as seem to work in chaotic ones. In chaotic environments, people who make extreme decisions early and then follow through with them, in these cases at least, seem to have survived better than those who made what we would call sensible decisions.
I'm thinking now about, we talked about the Nizaris, how they employed assassination. And then, like you said, the Mamluks were extremely aggressive. And then some of these kingdoms tried sort of a middle way between diplomacy and submission. And one chapter that, I don't know if it's a chapter, but part of the book that made me smile a lot is the Byzantium, the empire over there, and how they realized that they don't have the military strength. And they also didn't kind of want to submit, so they tried like scheming in diplomacy for a really, really long time. These are my kind of people. Of course, at the end, it kind of didn't help because they also got destroyed. But yeah, at least they tried, I suppose.
They did. I mean, the Byzantines had the unique characteristic of managing to find a third alternative in Mongol diplomacy, because normally it's submit or face invasion. The Byzantines' third way was to keep talking, to make it maybe we'll submit, but we need to carry on talking about it. And on one occasion, the Mongols' ambassadors died of illness, which may well have been illness. And on another occasion, the Byzantines led the Mongols through their empire through the most complicated route possible to give the impression their empire was huge, which they could then use to help negotiate. But yeah, even so, the Byzantines, the sources don't say they submitted, but they did come to terms with the Mongols, and it's difficult to believe that involves anything other than submission. So yeah.
Professor Nick, thank you. So now I'm calling you Professor Nick, which is the worst combination of all. Thank you so much. What a delight, as always. However, this isn't the only book you wrote. You have many more books, so maybe we're going to have many more conversations.
I hope
if you're willing. If you're willing.
Yeah, I've written or edited lots of books, and those include books on the military history of the Crusades. I've written a book on the first Crusaders' early relations and perceptions of Islam. I've written a book on the military orders, so Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights. So there's lots to see. If you want details of my book, just type my name into Google and you'll see either my YouTube site, which has a handle of @Medieval Near East, or you'll see my university address. Just type in Nicholas Morton, Nottingham-Trent University. You can also follow me on Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky, Threads, and LinkedIn.
Awesome. There you go. Where can people find your book? I can't show a copy because I bought the Kindle version.
Okay.
Maybe you have a copy over there that you can show? Okay.
Hold that thought.
Just a sec. We'll do.
So yes.
There we go.
This is Mongol Storm. There it is. But I have a new storm arriving next year, which is going to be called the Crusader Storm. So that will be a book exploring the history of the Crusades in the century before the Mongols. But like the Mongol Storm, it's looking at the Crusades from lots of different cultural perspectives. So Mongol Storm is looking at the Mongol invasions from about 10 different cultural perspectives. The Crusader Storm will be looking at the Crusades from about 10 different cultural perspectives.
Outstanding. Looking forward to it. And thanks again. Thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe to the podcast on YouTube, follow and rate on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Every marketing tutorial out there insists it's really important that I hassle you about this, so I'm doing it right now. Also, if you'd like to, please support me on Patreon. This is a one-person podcast, as I always say. I do everything by my little old self. There's no team behind me. It's very sad, I know, but you can help by hopping on Patreon and finding the Smart Cookies podcast on there. And then last but certainly not least, as always, I have to thank my existing patrons, Tovarishin Tovarishice, absolute legends. Without you, there would be no Smart Cookies, which makes you actual producers of this show. So eternal thanks goes to Amy Jontz, Matija Renčel, Florian Hauer, Petar Karba, Matija Zupančić, Dejan Žolnir, Darej Rok, Tržan, Saša Vipatnik, Neven Cvijanović, Juš Premrov, Sirkezi, Goran Ivašić, Anže Sever, Ole, Marin Ferrara, Aljaš Mahar, Štrole, Ajda Mancian, Miha Medved, Medinjo, Goran, Gordon, Lorenzo, Jurečuk, Mila, Carmen Veronica, and Tai Chi. I am deeply touched, so thank you very much.